Oil should have exploded. A blockade threat returned to Iranian ports. Ships were attacked near the Strait of Hormuz. A new Iraqi prime minister was heading into a meeting with President Trump, searching for oil and gas deals while the market braced for chaos. For decades, this was the nightmare scenario. Experts once warned that a major Gulf disruption could send crude toward $200 a barrel and gasoline toward $10 a gallon. Instead, oil hovered in the upper $70, still under $80. That was not calm. That was a signal. The old energy order was cracking in real time. OPEC was no longer the only price king. The Strait of Hormuz was no longer the single pressure point, and Iraq was being pulled into a power game where every barrel had become leverage. The question was brutal. Who now controls energy? The timing could not be ignored. President Trump was preparing to sit down with Iraq's new prime minister, and energy was expected to dominate the conversation. New oil and gas deals with the United States were on the table, while Iraq faced rising pressure to supply a nervous market. Then came the trigger. U.S. forces were preparing a renewed blockade around Iranian ports. At the same time, Iranian attacks on ships near the Strait of Hormuz rattled traders who watch every missile, every tanker route, and every insurance premium. Prices moved fast. Crude climbed during the first 2 days of the week, reaching roughly $75 to $77 a barrel by the close. It was still below $80, but it had recently been closer to the $60 range. That gap mattered, because in oil, a few dollars can move billions. Fear can move even faster. And when fear enters the market, it does not ask permission before hitting consumers, governments, and alliances. This time, fear blinked. That was the strange part. The headlines looked dangerous, the geography was dangerous, the players were dangerous. But the price did not behave like the old playbook said it should. For half a century, the Strait of Hormuz was treated like the throat of the global oil system. Block it, and the world coughs. Millions of barrels move through that narrow waterway. Asian refiners depend on it. Gulf exporters depend on it. Shipping companies price risk around it. Governments build emergency plans around it. So when attacks hit ships in that region, the market reaction should have been violent. Traders had seen this script before. Conflict in the Gulf, panic buying, supply fears, and higher fuel prices at street level. But this time, something broke in the pattern. Prices rose, but they did not detonate. Gasoline moved, but it did not spiral into the nightmare numbers once forecast. The national average stayed in the $3 range, with some areas moving between $3 and change and $4 and change. Only pennies moved. One day's shift was around 2 cents for regular unleaded, even as the market remained open and unstable. That small movement carried a massive message. Traders were scared, but they were not convinced the world was out of oil. That was the twist. The market was not pricing the Strait of Hormuz like the old days. It was pricing a new map where supply could come from more places, and power had shifted beyond OPEC's traditional grip. The choke point still mattered. It just no longer owned the whole world. K.T. McFarland, a former Deputy National Security Advisor, pointed to that exact change. The ceasefire had ended, but prices had not surged back to extreme levels. Oil was sitting near $75 to $77. Her takeaway was explosive. Hormuz still mattered, but it no longer held the entire market hostage. The old fear was still alive, but it was no longer absolute. And once a fear stops being absolute, the people who used it as leverage lose something they may never get back. That is when the real power shift becomes visible. The reason was not mystery, it was production. The United States had become the world's largest oil producer, and that changed the psychology of every crisis. In old energy shocks, the market looked first to OPEC and Saudi Arabia. In this shock, traders looked across the Atlantic. That was new power. Phil Flynn, an oil trader and senior market analyst at Price Futures Group, described the shift as a historic reversal. The United States was no longer just a buyer exposed to foreign decisions. It had become the swing producer. That phrase is everything. A swing producer can increase or reduce output in ways that influence price. For decades, that role gave OPEC enormous market power. Now, shale, drilling policy, and production scale had weakened that monopoly. The market was not just asking what Iran might do, it was asking how much America could absorb. That changes diplomacy. It changes sanctions. It changes military pressure. And it changes the way oil states negotiate when crisis hits. Iraq knew it. That is why the Iraqi Prime Minister's meeting mattered. Iraq was not just another oil state looking for diplomatic headlines. In that discussion, Iraq was described as the second biggest producer inside OPEC, after the United Arab Emirates had exited that framework. There had even been threats that Iraq could leave OPEC. Whether used as negotiation or warning, that possibility exposed a deeper fracture. The cartel that once presented a united front was facing a world where members had other options. The old club looked nervous. If Iraq deepened ties with Washington, the balance would shift again. Oil deals would not just be commercial contracts. They would become signals to OPEC, Iran, China, and every importer watching the Gulf. Energy had become diplomacy with invoices attached. That is the center of the story. Iraq wanted deals. The United States wanted influence. Iran wanted pressure. OPEC wanted cohesion. And the market, instead of screaming, was quietly measuring who still had control. A decade ago, the script would have been simpler. Gulf threat, oil spike, gasoline panic, political pressure. But now, the market had more variables, more production, more suppliers, more confidence that one waterway, even one as critical as Hormuz, might not be enough to break the system. That confidence was the shock. Then came the market's strangest message. Even with missiles, blockade threats, and tanker danger, long-term prices did not scream catastrophe. The front end of the oil curve jumped, but the back end suggested traders expected the conflict to pass quickly. That matters. Oil markets are not just about today's price. They are bets on tomorrow's risk. When near-term barrels rise, but later contracts stay calmer, traders are saying one thing. This may be sharp, but not permanent. Flynn connected that to military expectations. The market, in his view, was pricing a U.S. advantage and assuming the disruption would not last long. He compared it to an earlier moment when oil reached $119, while later contracts still implied prices would come down. And they did. That memory now shaped confidence. If the market had correctly predicted relief before, it might be doing the same again. This is why panic did not fully take over, even as the headlines looked dangerous. But another energy war was forming beneath the oil war. Artificial intelligence entered the story because data centers need staggering amounts of power. The race for AI is not only about chips, software, and talent. It is about electricity at industrial scale. That is the hidden battlefield. IBM was cited after a brutal trading day, with shares down around 26%. The immediate issue was financial pressure around AI spending, but the deeper question was larger. Who can afford the power? In New York, political leaders were debating whether more data processing centers should be allowed based on energy needs. That single issue exposed the next bottleneck. A country can lead in AI only if its grid can carry the load. No power, no dominance. This is why old energy assets suddenly looked strategic again. 3 Mile Island, a nuclear site with deep historical weight, became part of the conversation. Microsoft and others were linked to the idea of building data centers near reliable nuclear power. That is not nostalgia. It is survival math. AI consumes electricity. Electricity needs generation. Generation needs policy, capital, and public acceptance. If private companies build massive data centers, the argument follows that they may also need to help build the power behind them. The oil war and the AI race were becoming the same story. One was about barrels. The other was about megawatts. But both came down to the same brutal question. Who has enough energy to keep moving when everyone else starts to panic? That is why the oil price mattered so much. Not because $75 to $77 was historically shocking. Not because gasoline moved by 2 cents. But because the market was revealing a new hierarchy. Energy is not just a commodity. It is negotiating power. If you have supply, you can wait. If you have production, you can threaten less and still influence more. If you have power, you can build data centers, train AI systems, run factories, and keep your economy breathing while others beg for relief. But if you depend on someone else's barrel, someone else's grid, or someone else's shipping lane, you are not only buying energy. This was never only about one blockade, one meeting, or 1 week of higher crude prices. It was about control. Iraq needed deals. Iran wanted pressure through shipping fear. OPEC faced cracks. The United States had become the largest producer and a swing force in global supply. Oil stayed in the upper 70s instead of racing toward the disaster levels once imagined. That price was a verdict. Markets were saying the energy map had changed. The Strait of Hormuz remained dangerous, but it was no longer the whole board. And as AI demanded more electricity, power itself became the next global currency. The lesson is simple. Energy decides who negotiates from strength, who panics, and who builds the future. In the next crisis, the winner may not be the country with the loudest threat. It may be the one with the last available barrel. It may be the one with the grid strong enough to feed the machines. And it may be the one that understands the new truth first. In the next world order, power will belong to whoever can still produce power.